Listening comprehension is essential when learning Chinese, but if we want to improve, we need to move beyond tīng dǒng and identify what the problem really is. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about listening comprehension. This is a topic I've focused on a lot recently and it's a fascinating one, and therefore I've decided to devote a whole series of articles and podcasts to listening comprehension in Chinese. This will go against the grain of most online content these days, so I will aim for longer articles going in depth into how listening comprehension works and how you as a student can use that to your own advantage, or if you're a teacher, how you can use this to help your students improve. This first episode will be an overview and I will summarize some of the most important lessons, and then subsequent episodes will go into more detail in specific areas. And of course, I realize that not everybody is obsessed by listening comprehension, so I will not publish all episodes in a row, but rather I will spread them out over the next 6 months or so. This means that there will be room to discuss other aspects of learning Chinese as well, but I think that listening comprehension is maybe the most neglected skill of all, and so that's why we're focusing an entire series on this specific topic. These episodes will also be more scientific and I will provide more references and further reading, but since these are rather hard to convey in spoken podcast format, please refer to the written article on Hacking Chinese. Naturally, I don't focus on listening ability here just because I'm interested in it. It also turns out to be the area of Chinese that most students say that they think is the most challenging. And this is based on a poll I did a few years ago with several hundred participants here on Hacking Chinese, and listening ability actually came out on top as the most challenging aspect of learning the language. And I think that to a naive observer, this might be a little bit weird. Wouldn't the characters be harder to learn, and isn't speaking harder to master with all the tones, initials and finals and so on? But apparently not. Most people say that listening is actually the hardest. I will say some things that will explain that in this episode, but of course the entire series is about this, and we will gradually figure out why listening is actually quite hard, what specific challenges you can face, and what to do about them. Looked at from another angle, I also think it's safe to say that listening is actually the most important skill of all, and I have several reasons for saying that. First, listening is a gateway to the rest of the language, because the more you understand of what you hear around you, the more opportunities you have to learn even more. But if you don't understand what's going on around you, then this gateway will be closed and you will not learn these things. You're missing out on a lot of learning opportunities. This is true for reading to a certain extent as well, but listening is something that you can really immerse in, and you can hear the language all around you, or you can make sure that you do, even if you're in your home country, by, say, creating a digital immersion environment. And, well, this works for reading too, but reading is still something you actually focus on doing, whereas listening is something you can combine with lots of other activities, and it's rather easy to fill your days with listening if you want to. I also think that listening is much more important than any other skill when it comes to integrating in a Chinese-speaking environment. And this might be with Chinese-speaking family members or significant others, even if you don't live in a Chinese-speaking environment, but it might also be in an environment where people do speak Chinese and you need to fit in. Because if your listening ability is up to par, you can understand what's going on in conversations and you will feel much more included. It doesn't really help to be able to say a few things if you don't understand what other people are saying and you don't know when you're supposed to say the things you can say. Similarly, if you ask questions but you don't understand what people answer when you say these questions, it doesn't really help that much to be able to say these things. Therefore, I think it's a pity that listening comprehension is not really something that's focused on in most institutional learning. Most courses will only contain listening comprehension tests, and that's essentially all you do for listening. And this is a little bit like in PE class. You always test how far you can jump, how fast you can run, but the PE teacher doesn't necessarily teach you how to run faster or jump further. You just measure how good you are and you move on. And this is a little bit what listening comprehension feels like in most classrooms. There's also a strong focus on the written language in many classrooms, especially at university level, where most exams will be written rather than spoken, and where you may even be able to pass courses without being able to speak or understand spoken Chinese at all. Finally, listening ability is not very shiny. It's not something you can show off. I mean, if your tones are great and your initials are really neat, then you can show off your pronunciation and native speakers will be very impressed. But nobody will notice all the thousands and thousands of hours you spent on listening, except in the sense that it also carries over to speaking. So if you are at a polyglot gathering, it's easy to show off your Chinese tones, but it's rather hard to show people that you've listened to 10,000 hours of Chinese audio. Now, I hope that most of us aren't learning Chinese to show it off to other people. That's really not the point. The point is to engage with real people and be able to use the language for communication in various directions and manners. So this doesn't really concern us here. The goal is to learn Chinese, and then you really need a strong foundation in listening. One way of looking at it is to say that speaking ability, it's the tip of the iceberg that sticks up over the surface, and that's about 10% of the whole iceberg. The rest is built on input that isn't visible, it's under the surface. So I've chosen to call this series Beyond tīng dǒng. And by that I mean that most students, when they don't understand something, they might say tīng dǒng, or they might just note to themselves that, oh, I didn't understand, that was really bad. But the point I want to make here is that if you want to improve your listening ability, or improve the listening ability of your students, you need to move beyond this tīng dǒng and see what actually happened there. What did cause me or the student to not understand what was said here? And then when you understand that, you know what to practice, and then you can go on and figure out how to practice that in the best manner, and so on. But if you stop at tīng dǒng, you can't really get very far, and you certainly can't figure out what the best way is to improve. So to give you an example of how complex listening ability is and how many different things can go wrong, let's look at a simple sentence like 你吃了吗, which at surface level just means have you eaten. So if you don't understand this sentence, it could be for a number of reasons. And of course, I'm only using this as an example that is beginner friendly. You can think of your own examples for more advanced learners, but the principles remain the same. So for example, at a very basic level, it could be that you haven't learned how the tones interact and how sounds are pronounced in context. So for example, if you learned the word ni as a dipping tone, like I said it now, ni, you might be a bit perplexed as a beginner, because in this sentence, 你吃了吗, ni is just a low tone. 你吃了吗, it isn't a dipping tone at all. There are also other things that happen to parts of this sentence. For example, the neutral tones are influenced a lot by intonation here, and they are a lot higher than they would be if this wasn't a question. These are things that are obvious for intermediate and advanced students, but if you're a beginner, you learn a word in a certain context, it might not be so obvious if you encounter this word in a different context, where it is in fact pronounced differently. As advanced speakers, or indeed native speakers, we know that a word can have different pronunciations in different contexts. Like we don't say ni the same way, we have this dipping tone ni. Sometimes it's a rising tone, as in ni hao. And then we have this low tone, which is most of the time when it's in front of, well, anything that isn't the third tone. But to a beginner, these still have 3 different tone contours, and it's not obvious that they are the same word. In the research literature on listening comprehension, this type of problem is actually rather common, i.e. that students have learned a word in one context with one pronunciation, and then when it appears in a different context where pronunciation is just altered a little bit, students suddenly don't understand it at all and can't even connect it with the word that they have learned. Another issue that is particularly serious in Chinese, or maybe I should say especially important, is to figure out how words and phrases function and how they are structured. So 吃饭 is a verb-object compound that most people learn early on, but they learn it as the meaning eat. So to eat is to 吃饭, but it's actually, like I said, a verb-noun compound, so 吃works on its own as well. Again, this will be obvious for intermediate and advanced learners, but I'm just bringing it up as an example, and I've written extensively about word formation in Chinese, and these articles probably include lots of things that more advanced students don't know about either. So I've put these in the description. Links in the description as usual. In order to understand a sentence like 你吃了吗, you also need to understand the particles le and ma, and how these are used here. And this is more related to grammar than listening comprehension, but of course, if you don't have the grammatical structure for a sentence, it becomes impossible to understand it, whether it's in reading or writing. So sometimes tīng dǒng might not be related to listening as such. Maybe it's a vocabulary problem, maybe it's a grammar problem, or maybe it's a combination of the two. Maybe it's related to word order or something else. Or maybe it could be that the speaker has an accent that you're not used to, and that therefore you don't understand what's being said. Maybe they switch N and L and say li instead of ni here, or they use some other pronunciation you're not used to. and this will throw you off even if you know the sentence very well. It could also be that the sentence is delivered very quickly or very suddenly and you don't have time to parse it properly, and the result is tīng dǒng, even though if it was slowed down you would very well understand what they're saying. Finally, it could be that you do actually understand exactly what the sentence means, but you don't understand why someone is saying it to you. You fail to interpret it in context. This is of course partly why I chose this specific example, because nichilema is used as a kind of greeting here. It's not necessarily asking for information. Just like when you say what's up, nobody actually wants to hear the sky or the ceiling or something like that. Such as if someone says how do you do, it might just be a way to say hello rather than a question for information about how you are currently doing. This usage is not very common among younger Chinese speakers, but it is still common among middle-aged people and above. If you don't know about this usage, it can be rather perplexing, like why is this person asking this question all the time about if I've eaten or not, why is this interesting? And the result is a kind of tīng dǒng, because, well, you do understand what they are saying, but you still fail to interpret the situation correctly. And learning Chinese, there are of course thousands of cases like this. You always encounter situations where someone says something, but you fail to interpret it properly. And this is also a part of listening comprehension. So I hope that these examples have shown that listening comprehension is rather complex, and there are many things that can happen and result in tīng dǒng. And the goal with this series of episodes and articles is to move beyond this tīng dǒng and figure out what's actually going on or what could go wrong and what can we do about it. This type of inquiry, though, is not something that comes naturally to most people, because the only thing we have to compare with is our native language. And in our native language, listening comprehension is very quick and highly automated. In fact, it's automated to a point where most people who haven't learned a foreign language seldom think about listening comprehension as an issue at all. It just happens. So this means that the difficulty of the task of processing spoken language only becomes apparent when we're learning a foreign language, such as Chinese in our case. Then processing of spoken language is not automated at all, and we need to actively process a lot more, and this is simply not something our brains are equipped to do. So, as we have seen, listening in a foreign language is very different from listening in one's first language. Listening is also different from reading in many regards, even though they have certain things in common. Back in 1985, British linguist Halliday had a very good way of explaining the difference, and he said that reading is like looking at a picture where you can take your time and choose to focus on one thing at a time, whereas listening is like watching a movie where things constantly change and there's so much going on at once that it's impossible to take everything in at once. I think this illustrates the feeling of listening versus reading in Chinese quite well. So reading is obviously challenging, but you can usually take your time and work your way through something. Whereas listening feels more like an onslaught of spoken language that you can't deal with, and it's so fast. You pick one thing up, but then there comes 10 other things after that, and you just get mired in things you don't understand and quickly give up. And this leads us to the next thing that makes listening difficult, and that is that we're out of control. Compare with when you're speaking Chinese, you can choose to use the words that you've learned and the grammar and so on, and you can forge sentences that express what you want and you can communicate with other people. But when you listen, you can't really control anything. The speaker is the one who controls the speed, which words are used, which grammar is used, and what topics are covered, and so on. If this person is speaking directly to you and they know that you're a language learner, maybe they will try to use simpler words and maybe slow down and so on. But not everybody does this, and if you're, say, watching a movie, listening to a podcast or something like that, they don't know who's going to listen and they can't adjust it to your level. If you're talking with a real person, you can sometimes influence what they say. For example, you can ask them to speak more slowly or you can ask them to repeat. But normally, when you listen, you don't have any control over anything, compared with when you are speaking, when you're writing, or even when you're reading, when you can still control the pace and you can look things up easily and so on. I think I've established why listening ability is important and why it's an interesting topic to discuss. And at this point, I originally planned to just share with you a list of episodes that I have planned in this series, but then I thought this is not very interesting. Most people don't want to wait for weeks or months to get all this content. So instead, I will try to summarize 3 important factors that influence how much you learn when listening and how to maximize these. So we have some concrete hands-on tips for how to improve your listening right now. And well, of course, we will go into more details in subsequent episodes, but we will still get started here. So in an earlier episode on Hacking Chinese, and again, link in the description, I discussed 3 factors that decide how much Chinese you learn. And these 3 factors can be applied to listening as well, of course. And these are content, i.e. what you should listen to, method, or how you should listen, and quantity, how much you should listen. So if you maximize these 3, you will get a lot out of your listening. So let's have a quick look at each. So when it comes to content, i.e. what you should listen to things that contain roughly the kind of Chinese that you want to learn. And it should be fairly close to your current level, meaning that you should be able to make sense of as much as possible, preferably almost everything. It might sound rather obvious that you should listen to the type of language you want to learn, but this can be very hard, especially for beginners, because it's simply very hard to produce listening material for someone who only knows 100 words, for example. And this means that many beginner podcasts use a lot of English. And of course, I shouldn't say too much, this podcast is entirely in English, but the point here is not to teach you Chinese listening directly, it's to help you or inspire you to focus more on listening, so that then can improve your Chinese listening ability. This is very important because many learners are fooled by this, i.e. they think that they are listening a lot, but actually they're not. So if you're listening to a beginner podcast that is 10 minutes long and contains a short dialogue, maybe 20-30 seconds, that is repeated a few times, and then there might be the occasional vocabulary item and maybe a grammar pattern or something. The actual Chinese content in such an episode can maybe sometimes only be like 1/5. So that means in 10 minutes you only actually practice 2 minutes of listening. The rest maybe is useful for something else, but it certainly isn't listening practice. In an upcoming episode, I will discuss the best listening resources, but if you do have beginner listening resource recommendations for me, i.e. podcasts or YouTube channels or whatever, where they speak mostly Chinese aimed at very low level, so preferably 0 beginners or on a very elementary level at least, please let me know because these are really hard to find. So in short, you should focus on comprehensible input. That means that you should be able to connect the spoken form with meaning and make sense of what you're listening to most of the time. And that also means that you have a bigger chance of learning the things you didn't understand. And it also becomes much more enjoyable when you understand what you're listening to without having to spend an hour in a dictionary for every 10 minutes of audio you listen to. Another important lesson here is that you should really aim for both quantity and quality at the same time. And since quantity is one of the factors that I will discuss next, I will focus a little bit more on quality here. So different qualities of listening are all useful. If you have time and you can sit down and listen to Chinese and do nothing else and focus and do your best to really understand, that's awesome, do that. But if you also have time when you're out jogging, when you're cooking, when you are at the supermarket or whatever, listen to Chinese while doing other things as well. This is something you can train and you can get better at it, and this will allow you to fill your weeks with loads of Chinese, which is awesome. And then, even when you think you don't have time to learn any Chinese, you can still have Chinese on in the background. Maybe it's music, maybe it's a podcast episode you listened to a while back, and you will occasionally focus on it a little bit and pick something up. Quantity has a quality all of its own. And so, on to the third factor, which is quantity, or how much you should listen. And this is rather obvious, you should listen as much as you can. Now, I know that doesn't really help. You could say the same thing about anything when learning a language, so I will be a little bit more specific. I think that the time spent listening should be the same as all the other time you spend learning Chinese combined. Yes, that's right. That means that all your reading, vocabulary learning, grammar, going to class, speaking, everything. If you add up all those hours, you should listen that much. Of course, this doesn't mean that you just sit down in front of your computer or your phone and you do nothing but listen for all those hours. I include more passive forms of listening when you're out jogging, like I said, or when you're doing other things on a commute or, all these other things. So it's all types of listening combined should add up to this. This is not as unreasonable as it might sound, because of course it's very difficult to read Chinese while jogging, but listening is perfectly fine. And the number of activities you can combine listening with is actually very large. You can argue that you can combine it with almost anything else, whereas, say, studying characters is something you can really only do in a very small set of circumstances. If you want to know more about this, check out episode 57, where we talked about 7 ideas for smooth and effortless Chinese listening practice. So we're reaching the end of this first introductory episode, and in the next 2 we will talk about how we process spoken Chinese, and we will do that in 2 episodes. The first one looks at bottom-up processing, and that is about extracting information from the spoken language. And well, it might sound like, isn't that what listening is? But as we shall see, and as we have already seen in this episode actually, there's more to listening than that. So if bottom-up processing is like using bricks to build a house, where the bricks then would be, say, individual sounds in the language, tones and so on, we still need some kind of idea how these fit together and how they can form a building or some kind of meaningful construct. To do that, we need top-down processing, which we will focus on in the episode after next one. Or rather, that's the order in this series, because I will discuss other topics in between. So bottom-up processing, or extracting information from the spoken language, it will be the focus of next week's episode, and then we will turn to top-down processing a few weeks later. So top-down processing is more about interpreting what you're hearing and using things that you know to make sense of what you hear. It's a little bit like looking at the blueprint of a house to figure out where a certain brick or piece needs to go. And then also know enough about architecture to realize that there really should be a corridor here and a load-bearing wall there, or notice that something is wrong when there is a room without a door or something like that. Top-down processing is also very useful because it helps us limit the number of possible options, like what could this mean, and that can make it much easier to understand something. And this is also something that is under conscious control to a certain extent, i.e. we can use different strategies to make it more likely that we will interpret something correctly. But more about that later. I think that's quite enough for an introductory episode, and stay tuned for next week's episode where we will move beyond tīng dǒng to improve our Chinese listening ability. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.